Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you can hear me. This is Steve here. It's about 5 to 4. We're live on YouTube as of a couple of minutes ago. I'll wait till the top of the hour. We'll go live with the lecture at 4 o'clock. Thank you. As usual, we're going to run the chat in Discord, and Sarah will be managing the chat from 4 p.m. So I'll see you in 5 minutes. Share screen. That's what I forgot. Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm hoping that you can see the opening lecture slide for Thursday of week 1. Got a few confirmations of that on the chat, which is great. Wonderful. So, welcome to the second lecture, Zoom lecture. Everyone's either watching on YouTube or Zoom. It will be recorded and made available on Blackboard once the processing's done. So, even though the opening slide there says Brenton's name. Brenton was the one that prepared the slides, but this is Steve speaking to you now. And down the corridor on the Discord chat is my colleague, Sarah Johnson. So I wanted to cover 3 things with you today. The lecture slides that you see in front of you really cover mostly just one of those, but I want to top and tail the content of today's lecture with some other material. So for the most part of today's lecture, we'll be working through the slides here. And earlier this afternoon, I made those slides available on Discord and also on Blackboard. And so the focus of the lecture content is going to be on algorithms and something called pseudocode, and I'll explain what that is. But before we did that, I thought it might be helpful to just take a step back and move to the PyCharm IDE, which has been the basis of our the labs this week. For some of you, this will be a confirmation. What I'm about to show you in a moment will be a confirmation of what you've already seen in the labs. For some of you, it'll be a precursor to the lab you'll see tomorrow. But I do want to make a critical link between what we saw in Monday's lecture and the content of the lab as we move into next week. So let me just make this a little bit larger. Okay. Oh, one. I want to bring up the Python console. So this is the console. Remember, this is like the way we can provide, we can engage with the Python IDE, the integrated development environment, in an interactive fashion. So if I type in the expression, it needs to be a valid Python expression. If I type in the expression x equals 1, seemingly nothing happens in the console itself. Although if you look carefully on the right-hand side, up towards the top, you'll see a little expression that says x equals left curly brace int, right curly brace 1. That's telling us 2 important things. That's telling us that the variable x, remember a variable is a label that we attach to stored information. That variable now has a value, in this case 1. It also has a type, which means, and the int is short for integer, a round number, 1, a counting number, 1, 2, 3, including negative numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So that's helpful information. We could type in another variable into the Python console, and up on the right hand side we'll see y equals left curly brace float 4.2, and that means that the variable y has the value 4.2, and the float is Python's way of saying it's short for a floating point number, which is probably new terminology to you. What it means is it's a real valued number. It doesn't have to be an integer. In this case, it's got the value 4.2. And so we're now starting to use terminology about variables. which have values, in this case 1, 4.2, and also types, in this case integer and float. So the console that you see here on the screen now is actually a really convenient way of running small bits of code, 2, 3, 4 lines at a time. You can back up, you can use the up arrow to go back to previous commands. You can then edit them, change the value, it gets reflected on the right. If we want to print the value, we can also, that's another valid Python expression, we can print Y and it's printed for us on the console, and so on. So the console is really helpful as a way of getting started, but it's not a very helpful or convenient way of writing larger programs. And for that, we need to go to the let me have a look here. We go to, if I bring up my Python program that I've written in the Python editor. For those of you that have done the lab this week, you'll recognize the code that you see here. It's the first example in the textbook. It sets the value for 3 variables, V0, G, and T, and then it calculates an expression. So the expression for Y depends on the values given to V0, T, and G as our 3 variables, and then it prints the value. And so now we've got the ability in the Python IDE. I won't go through all the details, but the point is that you can edit them, write a file, and then execute that file. And that means that far from being restricted to 1 or 2 or 3 instructions at a time, we can write scripts, programs that have hundreds, sometimes thousands of lines at a time. And so for many of you this week, you've written your very first computer program ever, which is fantastic. And you've done it in the Python IDE by editing a program that looks like this. Now, something that I want to show you, it's come up in a number of questions, and it's a really important point, and I did not show it to you on Monday's lecture deliberately. I wanted to get you started with the console and get your hands on these short programs in the lab, but I'm not sure I can do this in a way that displays easily on the. Let's have a look here. No. So what I'm going to do, just for a moment, I'm going to drop out of presentation mode, and I want to show you something that only appears in the window we've seen at the moment. I realise it's very small, but at the top of the right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see a little drop-down menu, and in it, in a very small font, it says main. Main is the name of the last program I was editing. The name of this program that you see on the screen, however, is called testing ball. So in order to run the script that you see on the screen, I need to change the program or the script that's run. And so I do that by selecting the run option from the top of the screen, and then the run drop down, and then I choose the program that I want to run. In this case, it's called cube volume or testing ball. I select it, and then it runs. And now if I drop back to presentation mode, you'll be able to see when I run that script, run testing ball, it shows the value that's output to the screen at the bottom, in this case 1.2342. Now what I can do is go back and edit the time, for example, run that script, run it again, testing ball, and then we have the different number that's displayed there on the screen. So now we've got the ability not to just to do activities from the command line or the console, but to edit scripts and run programs and go back and edit them, refine them, improve them, enhance them, and run them in a way that's much more convenient for dealing with large code. So that's something I wanted to be able to show you, the distinction between the console and running a program. So let me just break out of that this window, and I'll bring back the lecture slides, and we'll pick up at this point. So that was the first thing I wanted to discuss with you today, this distinction between the console and a Python script. Beginning from next week, we'll probably start to use scripts a lot more than we will the console, but the console is still a very useful way of testing small amounts of code line by line. So here we are. Most of what you see on the slide here, the first slide is really just a statement of what I've already discussed in for you just in live chat just a moment ago. What the Python console is good for, and what script files are good for. And really, for anything beyond about 2 or 3 lines, we're going to use a script going forwards. I don't need to follow the instructions on slide 2 here, but what we've got in this slide is the ability for you to dynamically link to a copy of that the code that we've put in a repository that's publicly available. I'll say a lot more about how we access that repository, and indeed how you'll be able to create your own repositories as we go forward. Don't worry about the long file name here. What it really is just a pointer to a place that you can locate the file called ball.py, which is the code we just saw in the Python IDE. Okay. So now I want to switch to the main part of today's lecture, and I want to change gears a bit. Up until now, we've been very focused on getting your hands dirty with writing your very first programs, either in the Python, in the PyCharm IDE, either in the console or in the script. I want to take a little bit of a step back for about the next half an hour or so and talk more generally about algorithms and the way that, and what an algorithm is, and how we might represent it in a way that's convenient for us as humans to read. It's a step back because we're not going to be talking about Python for the next half an hour or so. We're going to be talking generally about what it is to write a program, what it means to run an algorithm, and then from next week on, we'll pick up with the specifics of algorithms and focus on the Python programming language. But what I want to do today is give you a mental framework, something that you might even refer back to in time, to give you a way of thinking about the way that computers execute programs. And I want to do that in a way that steps back from the Python language and just thinks about the concepts. So the first concept that I want to discuss is what an algorithm is. And informally, we can think of an algorithm as a series of steps which accomplishes a task. That task could be complex or it could be very simple, but the instructions need to sort of satisfy some characteristics. They need to have a strict order. So we're going to execute steps in a task, an algorithm, one after the other. They need to be unambiguous. So they need to be, there needs to be no room for interpretation. A step in an algorithm needs to provide a very clear capture of what that activity is, and there can't be any grey zones. Of course, that's ideally suited to writing computer programs, and it needs to be executable in the sense that, in a very concrete sense, that the so-called target platform needs to be capable of performing a task. Let me give you a very concrete example. You might be writing Python code which runs on a platform of an industrial welding robot. And so your algorithm might be instructing the welding robot to move the welding tip 1 centimeter to the left before it then puts applies a weld, executes a weld on a piece of metal. So that's the target platform, the welding robot. A mobile phone, which is also a different target platform for your algorithm, can't perform that task. And so I need to make that distinction because a language like Python is able to run on many different target platforms: mobile phone, supercomputer, or a welding robot. So they're the 3 characteristics that the steps in an algorithm have to satisfy. In this course, we're going to, from time to time, use something called pseudocode. And the pseudocode is going to communicate algorithms to ourselves, from me to you, from you to your peers, and among people. Separate from a pseudocode is the Python language, which is going to communicate algorithms to computers. So we've already seen in our first early steps earlier this week, at Monday's lecture, we saw that the Python language captures algorithms a very precise way. We need to absolutely eliminate any ambiguity. And in fact, computer programs, computer languages in general, Python's no different, need to be really precise about what they're capturing. And that means that sometimes an emphasis, you might say an overemphasis on getting the syntax of a statement right. Pseudocode, it's less strict because there's no one form of pseudocode. Pseudocode, if I'm thinking about how to solve a problem, pseudocode's typically what I do on a whiteboard with a pen in my hand, and I'm capturing the key steps in an algorithm, but I'm not actually writing code line by line. So Python is a precise language. Pseudocode is a way of capturing your working out, if you like. Let me give you an example of an algorithm that really is in the form of a pseudocode. And again, there's no, unlike Python, which has got a very strict language requirement, pseudocode isn't. So you might think about of an algorithm how to start a car, in this case, Brenton's car. The result of that algorithm should be a vehicle engine which is idling, and we start it from a well-defined state, which is we're standing next to the vehicle with the keys in your hand. And there are 8 steps identified in this algorithm. We'll move through them quickly. We know, so, but look at the key features that this algorithm is capturing. One is that we start from a known place, in this case, standing next to your car with the keys in your hand, and we know what the result we want to achieve is. We want to be sitting in the car with the vehicle engine idling, not moving, but idling. The first step of the algorithm is to depress the unlock button on the key fob, and we would expect the car to beep twice in response. We then put the key fob in our pocket. We then sit in the car in the driver's seat. We make sure that the gear selector is engaged in park. We then put foot on the brake. We then press the engine start button. We wait for 3 seconds. Those 7 steps have been executed in sequence. Notice how the sequence is important. Each of those 7 steps needs to be executed one after the other in the order that's indicated on the slide. It wouldn't make sense to wait before we execute step 1, where we depress the unlock button. It wouldn't make sense to press the engine start button before we were sitting in the driver's seat, for example. So those steps are executed one after another. In computer code such as Python, that sequential ordering of instructions is really well captured by lines of code that are executed one after another. And so you've already seen in the very small algorithms or the small code fragments that you've run in the lab this week, or will run in the lab this week, that typically each line of Python captures one step in an algorithm. So far, so good for steps 1 to 7. Step 8 is quite different. The step says if the engine's not idling, then we need to call a mechanic. And the reason step 8 is different from the previous 7 steps is the use of this if condition. For the first time, we haven't seen this in this course before. For the first time, we've got a step in an algorithm which actually requires a condition to be checked. If the engine's not idling, we call a mechanic. Otherwise, we've reached the desired result and the vehicle's engine is idling. These if statements are going to be absolutely crucial to capturing algorithms which do useful things for solving engineering problems. So to discuss this example, we've mostly discussed it on the way through, but you might think, who's ever thought of an algorithm for how to start a car before? You might think that algorithms in the form that you see here on the slides are over-explained. To us as humans, we just throw the key fob to a friend and say, can you drive home? Can you just start by getting the car idling, and then I'll give you instructions how to find home. That's not good enough for a computer. Computers, in a sense, are really stupid. They do things literally. They do what they're told, and they need to be told in a sequence of steps, and each of those steps needs to be small. So, a bit of advice to you then is that in this course, you should get in the habit of overthinking things. You should get in the habit of being precise in your thinking rather than just assuming that somehow your program will work even if you haven't gone through the steps of thinking about what the steps are one after the other. And I've already made this point before that this algorithm contained an if statement. It's called a condition or a conditional statement. And this conditional statement, mark it down. You've seen it for the first time on slide 5 here. We will see it throughout the rest of the course. This if statement is an example of what's called flow control. Up until now, the flow in our code fragments has been top to bottom, one statement after another. Flow control in computer programs allows those programs to take much more sophisticated courses of action as they execute. Testing conditions is going to be fundamental to solving engineering problems that we find in this course. We've pretty much said everything there. For today's lecture, I'm going to focus on a certain type of flow control known as if statements. There are other types of conditionals known as loops, where we get a computer to execute an instruction not just once, but many times, maybe thousands or even millions of times. And we'll introduce loops in week 3. But for now, or weeks 3 and 4, but for now, we're just going to talk in pseudocode, algorithmic, high-level terms, what it means to have conditional or if statements in a program. So these conditions that we're going to test, computers don't understand maybes. They understand black and white. So a condition must be absolutely true or false. So a human example of a true or false condition is I'm watching a lecture. True for you, not true for me. I'm presenting the lecture, or I am alive, or my net worth is below $100 million. Can confirm. Computer examples, because we know that what computers do, and in fact all they do, is manipulate numbers. So these conditions need to be related to numbers. So a computer example of a condition is that a variable I takes a value less than 184. A computer example of a condition is that variables x plus y added together is not equal to 0. Or another condition is that input data has been given to the program, or a condition such as a division by zeros occurred. So these true or false conditions are really important. And we'll give some terminology, some language to those later in today's lecture. But we're fortunate to have in the Discord chat today with us Sarah Johnson. Sarah, in fact, teaches the introductory computer engineering course in second semester, where in fact the whole semester is spent on designing hardware and understanding the implications of hardware which captures these true or false, black and white, 0 or 1 conditions. If we're going to execute conditional statements, sometimes we want to do more than one thing when we execute a group of instructions. And the terminology that's used for when a group of instructions are executed is a block of code or a block of instructions. Something else you see on this slide 9, is you'll see the word block presented in italics. Wherever possible, wherever we can remember, each time you see a piece of terminology that's used for the first time in this course, we'll endeavour to present it in italics. So the presence of those italics flags 2 things to you. One is that it's a new concept that's being introduced. The second thing is that the terminology that's being introduced has a precise meaning. So a code block is a group of instructions which are grouped together and executed one after the other, but in a group. So, for example, if we look at the bottom of this lecture slide, number 9, you'll see our first piece of pseudocode. Notice how it's typeset in typewriter font. That's our way of conveying to you that we're conveying pseudocode. It's also conveying to you the idea that that code or that pseudocode is not something you can type into a Python interpreter. It's for us as humans, you, me, the class, to exchange ideas, but it's not executable code. So if it's raining, then and I'm leaving for home, heading for work. If it's raining, that's a testable condition. Is it raining or not? Pack an umbrella, drive to campus instead of walking, and I need to leave home 40 minutes early to find parking. Actually, it's a bit better than that these days because with lectures primarily off campus, it's easier to find parking, but the point remains. If the condition's satisfied, we need to do 3 things, one after the other. Pack an umbrella, drive to campus, and leave home early. In fact, you could probably argue that those instructions should be reordered. If it's raining, pack an umbrella, leave home 40 minutes early, drive to campus instead of walking. So you could argue that those instructions could be reordered, but the main point on slide 9 is that those instructions are executed as a block, one after the other, but collectively. Notice that it doesn't say what happens if it's not raining. If it's not raining, then those 3 activities are not performed, but the pseudocode doesn't say what we do if it's not raining. Presumably, we don't pack an umbrella, we don't drive, but rather we walk, and we don't have to leave home 40 minutes early. So that's what you see here on slide 9, is one variation on an if statement. There are at least 3, and all 3 are captured in Python. But I want to talk about just in general terms, in pseudocode terms, rather than Python for today's lecture. So the if and else if, they're keywords. They're indicating conditions. The ... dots there between them indicate conditions that are satisfied. True or false conditions. Which variation on this end if and if else, if else and if, or if else if and if, depends on context, and we'll see a couple of examples today which will make that clear. Here are the 3 variations. You see them here on slide 10. Here they are written in a pseudocode form. So focus on the one at the top left for the moment. If a condition's satisfied, do some things. We just saw an example of that. If it's raining, pack an umbrella, drive instead of walk, leave 40 minutes early. That's do some things. The second variation, the one that you see at the bottom left of this slide 11, is if a condition, if one condition satisfied. So let me not look at the one on the bottom left. Let me look at the one on the right. The right condition says if a condition satisfied, like maybe if it's raining, do some things, else do some other things. So this would make precise the pseudocode around what to do if it's raining. If it's raining, pack an umbrella, drive, leave early. Else, don't pack an umbrella, walk instead of drive, no need to leave early. And the third variation, the one that you see on the bottom left, is if a condition satisfied, do some things, else if another condition satisfied, do some other things, otherwise drop through to the bottom. Yeah. All right, so why did I slide over page slide 12? Not because it's not important, but because we've mostly discussed it on the way to getting here. I'm about to introduce to you our first first or the most complicated algorithm that we've seen so far in this course, and it'll show you our first, I'll inverted commas, real algorithm, one that doesn't involve either starting a car or deciding if it's raining or not. But before I show you the expressions, it's the first use of mathematics in this course, and it's a nice opportunity for me to just step back and say, to talk a little bit about the mathematics assumed knowledge in this course. We assume that you've seen, understand, and remember mathematics up to year 10. That's the maths that we assume when you come into this course. Now, you may have more. You may have done maths at year 11 and 12. You may have done advanced maths in year 11 and 12, and that's great. The bare metal assumption that we make in this course is that you've seen and remember maths up until year 10. Now, the course may go beyond this. It will go beyond the use of year 10 maths because we're interested in solving problems that are important to engineers. But we also realise that your mathematical preparation is quite varied in this course. And so if we need to use maths that goes beyond year 10, and we will, we'll introduce and teach that maths in context as we need it. So there's no assumption that you know advanced maths beyond year 10, but because we will use and develop some mathematical content that goes beyond that level, we'll introduce it in context as it's needed. So here's our example. We're going to find the roots of a quadratic equation. So these are equations that you will have seen. We assume you've seen in high school that you would have seen a quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c. So if you're going to sketch a diagram of a graph of what that equation looks like, it's the set of points that lie on a parabola, either concave up or concave down. And the solutions of that equation are given by the points at which the parabola intersects the x-axis, and they're given by the famous formula that you see in equation number 2. X equals minus b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac on 2a. So that's our the context. We're looking for a way of computing the roots of that equation, whose solutions are given by the equation in equation 1, and the solutions are given by the expression in equation 2. So we're going to write an algorithm which provides some solutions to a quadratic equation. And I've put in this little qualifier here, real valued solutions. We'll see why in just a moment. So our algorithm, more complicated, more quantitative, more numerically based than starting a car or deciding whether it's raining or not, is an algorithm which is going to take 3 real numbers, a, b, and c. A, b, and c are the coefficients of the quadratic term, the squared term in the x. A, b, and c are the coefficient of the quadratic term, the linear term, and the offset term in this expression for a parabola. So we're given those, our algorithm takes as given those 3 real numbers. So if I was going to write a computer program to implement this algorithm, A, B, and C would be variables in a Python program, for example. Now, the output of our algorithm is going to be 3 numbers. It's going to be the number of solutions, n. N would be an integer. It's going to, and the second number is going to be one of the roots that we'll call x1, and the other number, the third number, is going to be x2. So our algorithm takes as input A, B, and C and produces as output n, x1, and x2. And the algorithm should have the following behavior. We're still not quite at the point of pseudocode, but we're thinking about what behavior the algorithm should perform in order to solve the problem of identifying the number of solutions and each of the roots x1 and x2. The output of the algorithm should be, if n is equal to 2, then x1 and x2 are different real numbers. If n is equal to 1, then x is the unique solution of the quadratic equation, and x2 is undefined. In fact, a little bit more mathematically sophisticated way would be to say that x1 is the unique solution and it occurs twice. But x1 is the unique solution and x2 is undefined. And the third point of behavior is if n is equal to 0, then x1 and x2 are both undefined. Doesn't say how we compute n, x1 and x2, but that's the desired behavior given the input and the output. And this is a really common way of thinking about solving problems in an engineering setting, that we are given a problem to solve, and before we actually get down to either writing a computer program or even defining a pseudocode which would solve the problem, we really grapple with what the input is and what the output is for that algorithm. And that's regardless of what sort of engineering problem you're attempting to solve. That's a really common characteristic, understanding the problem. And oftentimes this is a small and fairly simple example. In real engineering settings, and certainly in engineering research settings, sometimes it can take weeks, months, or sometimes it can take years to even understand not even how to solve an algorithm, solve a problem, but how to capture it in a way that's meaningful and useful. So I mentioned that little digression because in solving engineering problems, it's going to require a mode of thought that in some ways is quite different to the way that you might have seen at school, where it's presented as if there's some linear scientific method that's followed in order to solve solve a problem. In engineering context, that's typically not the case, and often for an engineer, coming up with a solution is only part of the task. Oftentimes, it's defining the problem that an engineer needs to do, is engaged to do. In which case, things like being clear about input, output, and behaviors of algorithms and pseudocode is every bit as important as the coded solution itself. Okay. Now, this is not the time or place for me to go into all the detail of how the pseudocode works. Point 1. Point 2, this is absolutely not Python code. Point 3, it could be converted into Python code, but I'm not going to show you that code today. What am I doing in presenting the code or the pseudocode that you see on the left? I'm giving you the first non-trivial example of an algorithm, such as we might see in solving an engineering problem. It's got clearly defined inputs, A, B, and C. It's got clearly defined outputs, which are n, x1, and x2. And there are numerical expressions which lay out the recipe for computing both n, x1, and x2 as part of this pseudocode. As we read the pseudocode, we're beginning at the top. The algorithm has a well-defined start, identified by begin, and it's got well-defined input. It's then got our first instruction, which is to compute d is equal to b squared minus 4ac. If you think back to the expression here in equation 2, it's no surprise that b squared minus 4ac occurs as part of the algorithm. And here we've got our first condition. We've computed what d is. D is a number. B squared minus 4ac, and A, B, and C have all been well-defined inputs to the algorithm. We've got our first conditional. If D is less than 0, in words, if D is negative, then we do an activity. In this case, we set the value of n to be equal to 0. Okay, that's the condition. If D is negative, then n is equal to 0. Remember what n is? We back up. N's the number of solutions. Notice that the behavior of the algorithm is if n is equal to 0, then x1 and x2 are undefined. And that's reflected in the pseudocode. If d is negative, n0, x1 and x2 undefined. If d was negative, we do an activity, we do some steps, one step. Else if d is equal to 0, then we do the following block of code. N is equal to 1, x is equal to minus b on 2a. That's well defined because both A and B are well defined inputs here. And else if d is greater than 0, then we execute 3 instructions. N is equal to 2, x is equal to minus b plus square root of d on 2a, x is equal to minus b minus square root of d on 2a. So again, in some sense, I'm not asking you to follow all the individual steps. I'm asking you to focus on the overall flow of that pseudocode. If a condition on D is satisfied, we take some steps. Else if D is equal, if a different condition is satisfied, we take some steps. Else if a third condition is satisfied, we take some other steps. One other thing I'd like you to notice is that notice how in the pseudocode, as we work from top to bottom, as we come to the conditions, we've deliberately indented the instructions in the code, in the pseudocode. That's really helpful for a couple of reasons. One is it really visually aids the identification of the code blocks. Remember we talked about blocks as being collections of instructions which are executed sequentially one after the other as a group. The use of indentation, spacing, really helps in identifying the code blocks. The second thing I'd say is that, in fact, that indentation, the use of space, is actually a key part of the Python programming language. This is not just something that looks nice on the screen. The Python language actually uses blocks and indentation to capture the idea of blocks of code that are executed depending on the value of the status of conditional statements. So that's really helpful to know. It's the indentation's not just something that's nice for us as humans to see. It's actually built into the Python language too. Okay, last few slides to set some terminology. This is not something that you're going to be able to take action on directly, although we will see this in action in next week's labs and indeed on Monday's lecture. It's something called Boolean Algebra, and it should be in italics because we've never seen it before. And Sarah, who's with us online here now, her course, Elect 1710 in second semester, is really built on the basis of Boolean Algebra. Boolean Algebra is a framework. It's actually a field of mathematics, but let's just talk about it as a framework for capturing this idea of quantities that are either true or false, 0 or 1. If you think back to the start of today's lecture, when I did the live demonstration of PyCharm, I introduced a couple of variables, X and Y. One of them was an integer. One of them was a float or a real number. Those floats and integers, they're what are called types of variables. We discussed that earlier. Well, Boolean values or Boolean variables are a particular way of a particular type of variable. So unlike an integer value, which can be 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, unlike a real value that's stored as a float, 4.1, for example, Boolean variables, and we're going to use these throughout this ENGG1003 course, Boolean variables can only take values true and false, 1 or 0. Once we've got those variables, we can mix and match them and perform operations on them using 3 operators, or, and not. And I just want to give you a sense, a flavor of them here, because Elect 1700 will use these quantities in a hardware context. We're going to use them in this course in a software context, because Boolean variables are what are used to create these conditional statements that I've been talking about today. The if statements, the if-else if statements, they're all based on the values of Boolean variables, variables that take values 0 or 1, true or false. I'm not going to go into the details there. I'm just going to skip over that. But the three variables that we use in, let me go through them. Yeah, so slide 19. In words, the OR operator that takes Boolean variables, we can have evaluates to be true if either of the things that operates on are true. So for example, in words, it could be if I'm standing next to my car and I have my keys in my pocket, that would involve the AND operation on two Boolean variables, one being, am I standing next to my car? The second quantity being, do I have the keys in my pocket? The only things that can be done with Boolean variables are and, or, and not. Or is true if either of the operands is true, and is true only with both things are true. I think, and you can see that, so we've got and, or, and not, and they're formally defined on slides 19 and 20. I'm going to skip over them quietly here, not because they're not important, but because I want you to see them in software context next week and be able to have this material to refer back to. I want to show you in Python, knowing that you've got a framework that we've presented in this lecture, but I don't want to go into the detail. So let me go through some word examples of some Boolean conditions. Let me drop to the second one. You will pass this course if two conditions are satisfied, and this is actually the case. So it's not only a good example of a Boolean condition, but it's actually a useful thing for you to know. You will pass this course if you score 40% or more in the final exam, and you get more than 50% overall. So for instance, if you scored 30% in the final exam and the weighted sum of all your assessments was 60%, would you pass the course? No, because in order for the Boolean condition about satisfying the course to be true, you'd need to satisfy two conditions: scoring 40% or more in the final exam and getting 50% or more overall. So that's a word example of a Boolean condition. Another one which uses the Boolean operator or is, my car needs a service if it's been more than 6 months since its last service, or 15,000 kilometers has been traveled. So maybe I only had a service 3 months ago, but I've done a lot of driving and I've driven more than 15,000 kilometers. I would need a service because one or more of those two conditions are satisfied. Namely, it hasn't been more than 6 months since I've had my car serviced, but I have driven more than 15,000 kilometers, so the car gets serviced. Okay. So, key parts of today's lecture have been use of the console and script files. You'll get to see it in this week's lab if you haven't already. We've talked about pseudocode and conditional statements in an abstract way or a framework way. We'll get to see these in a Python context to solve engineering problems next week. And then we've introduced Boolean variables as a way of capturing that. Okay. At this point, I'm going to pause because we've reached the third and final component of today's lecture. And what I want to do is just stop and pause and reflect. We've covered a lot of content this week. It's been a big week for you. For many of you, you've started university. You have joined a class, this class, which has got nearly 800 students in it. So we've been um, busily setting up a communication system with you um, via Discord. You've probably attended your first lab. You may have attended not only your first face-to-face lab, but a Zoom lab. Many of you, most of you have registered for the mandatory attendance at the face-to-face lab, or indeed navigated some of the imperfections in our tracking system for that. This is only one of maybe 4 courses that you're doing. All of them are going to have different instructions, different expectations about what needs to be attended, what needs to be material that's practiced and mastered. So what I'm saying is, it's been a busy week, and I'm very conscious of that. You might be sitting in the class thinking, wow, this week has moved really quickly. Am I going to be able to keep up with the course as we move through? I can't answer that question directly, but I do want to assure you that a lot of the busyness that's come about in this course this week has been setting up the communication mechanism so we can communicate with you as a student group, and that we, being myself, Sarah, Brenton, and the 20 or so demonstrators that are busily working with you in the lab groups, so that we can all share information and share our understanding and make the whole machine work. But I do want to say a couple of things. One is congratulations to you on being able to navigate that, because I'm aware that for many of you, it's your first experience of the higher education sector. You're probably navigating living out of home, cooking your first meals, dealing with all the stuff that happens in your life, regardless of whether you're going to uni or not. I just want to put on record that I'm aware of that. We take it into account, and there's no expectation that we're going to get all this right in the first week. I don't expect you to get it all right. I don't expect me to get it all right, and I don't expect our demonstrators to get it all right. We're working hard behind the scenes to make it all work, but you've done a lot this week, and I'm very conscious of that. I want to get the details of that machine right, because unless we get the machinery of the course right, we end up chasing our tail around the organizational elements of the course. And so when we get into the more advanced, the more interesting programming material in the weeks to follow, I want to make sure that we've basically got the organizational structure right. And I'm pretty happy with where we are towards the end of week 1. Still work to do, but I think we've made a lot of progress. So to that end, I want to encourage you, I really want to encourage you, when you're in the Discord server, to go through the process of using the bot, the bot code, to set yourself up as in the student role in the course. Only about half of you have gone through this process at the moment. What that means is that half of you are missing out on key information in Discord, because it's only when you get the student role that you see extra channels open up to you. And so it's not too late. It's the Thursday of week 1, but now's the time to get it right. If you don't know what I'm talking about, get into Discord, go to the announcements channel, and there's instructions in there on how you need to register as a student. Many of you will be doing it in your lab sessions, and I thank the demonstrators for assisting students through that process. It really is important, because going forwards, we're going to increasingly assume that you're in those student communication channels, because in the days ahead, we're going to start locking down the Discord server so that only registered students in the course get to see the content. So if you're not yet registered as a student in Discord, again, I urge you to go through that process. No need to panic. All the material that's there will become available to you once you're in as a student. but I am conscious that only about half of you in quite a large class are getting that content at the moment. So thanks for your attendance. This is the Thursday lecture of week 1. On Monday morning next, we'll pick up and we'll be moving through the remainder of chapter 1 and just slightly into chapter 2 of the text. Again, we will remain in contact on Discord until that point. If you haven't attended all your labs this week, I wish you all the best for doing that. Thank you for your attendance, and I'll see you on Monday. Bye for now.